good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another Eye on Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at MSU, African Studies Center. And we're very pleased today to have Dr. Jacqueline-Bethel Mougoué as our guest speaker. And I'm gonna let Dr. Jamie Monsoon introduce her. As many of you know, Dr. Monsoon is the director of the African Studies Center at MSU. So, Jamie.
Thank you so much, Awa. It's just delightful to have you with us, Dr. Jacqueline-Bethel Mougoué, to talk to us about your research and just warmly welcome you to Michigan State University, although we're doing this in a virtual space. Dr. Jacqueline Mougoué is an interdisciplinary feminist historian of Africa. She's the Assistant Professor of African Cultural Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's just recently published a book, Gender, Separatist Politics, and Embodied Nationalism in Cameroon. It was published by University of Michigan Press in 2019, and she has received the prestigious Frances Richardson Keller Sierra Prize from the Western Association of Women Historians, a prize that recognizes the best monograph in the field of history. She's published in a number of journals, including Gender and History, Feminist Africa, the Journal of West African History, and Meridian's Feminism, Race, and Transnationalism. And she's also on the editorial advisory boards for Feminist Africa and the Journal of Women's History. We're really, again, just delighted to welcome Dr. Mougoué to talk about her theme, When Women Wear Slacks, Gender and Embodied Nationalism in Africa. Welcome.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to thank Awasar, Nicole, Jamie, and the African Studies Center at Michigan State University for inviting me today and for organizing this virtual visit. And it's really great to be here, even if it is virtual. I thought I would spend around 20 minutes or so laying out the main themes of my book, which was published by the University of Michigan Press in late 2019. So let me pull up my slide and make sure everybody can see. Oops. Okay, can everybody see my slide? The first page. Okay, wonderful. Great, great. So here is the cover of the book. And I wanted to begin by talking about what are the two main themes in the book. The first one is gender, and the second one is everyday nationalism. I really wanted to highlight how women's everyday actions were very much politicized in Cameroon during the 1960s and in the early 1970s. And I wanted to highlight how these everyday actions can very much play a large role in political movements that are often seen and remembered in history as having male figures at the forefront, so playing the primary roles. What I uncovered during the research process, though, was that when focusing on how women's everyday actions can be politicized, we can learn much about how women's roles in political movements are not always radical or overt, in your face, meaning that they're not always kicking down the doors with big bazooka guns in their hands. What I found was that women's roles can be conservative, more subtle, and yet still make this deep and lasting impact that can still shape a nation's cultural identity today. The women that I focused in this work, formerly educated women, female political elites, the wives of government officials, really worked within patriarchal confines when trying to achieve two, what I saw were two multi-layered goals. In other words, they worked within male-dominated societies to first advance women's social and political rights, and second, to play a key role in a larger political movement. And I really want to be clear at this point and say that the women that I focused on did not label themselves as feminists. But I do maintain that they engage in what gender studies scholars call quote unquote feminist actions. So really behaviors or actions in which they supported women's advancements and equality in diverse areas of women's lives. I really believe that many of the findings of this book resonate beyond Cameroon and on a more global level. In other words, the research findings might compel us or perhaps force us to ask, what are the diverse, invisible, and subtle ways that women have played key roles in political movements? So whether that be a separatist movement, so a movement that supports the separation of a particular group of people from a larger bodies based on diverse factors such as religion, or whether that be a secessionist movement, one in which a group of people favor formal withdrawal from membership of a federation or body, really, especially a political state. Thus, Cameroon, I believe, becomes a nice case study where we can further examine these larger questions and analyze the connection between gender and everyday nationalism. I thought I would begin by sharing the ever-changing map of Cameroon on this screen so we can better understand how Cameroon can be a nice case study where we can examine the connection between gender and everyday nationalism. Women's efforts to play leading roles in these larger political movements in the 1960s and early 1970s really began after Cameroon achieved independence from European rule in the early 1960s. So as you can tell on these diverse map, Cameroon is a West Central African country that fell under the shadows of European rule, much like other countries in the global South in the 19th and 20th centuries. But unlike many of these countries, Cameroon was under dual European administrative rule at the same time. So from the early 1900s to the mid 1960s, it's under British and French administrative rule. And if you look at the map or the chart it's on my left side of the screen, on the top, we have the third image where part of the country is highlighted in blue and part of it is highlighted in red. So the blue part, the much larger part is under French rule, and the red part, the much smaller part, is under British rule. But by 1961, what we find is that both the British and French ruled regions of the country had gained independence, and both regions, which were separately ruled by the British and the French, united in October 1961. And this is where the problems really start to begin and to brew up. Because when they unite in October 1961, they form the Federal Republic of Cameroon. So this now unified country comprises of essentially an English-speaking West Cameroon state and a French-speaking East Cameroon state. So we have two federated states, and each state has its own government, laws, different national languages, different systems of even measurement, and they even drive on opposite sides of the road. And so I think in some ways I could slightly compare it to Germany when it was divided into two states for a while. Because each state was politically independent, they each had their own ideas about national identity when it was a federal republic between 1961 and 1972. What we see throughout the 1960s is, if we look at the map of Cameroon, where it is shaded in blue and red, you can see that the former French ruled part is much larger and there's more people there. So throughout the 1960s, a larger, more powerful Francophone state started to assert a more aggressive stance towards the Anglophone state, causing anxiety among Anglophone political elites and formerly educated urbanites that Anglophone cultural values, national identity, and political power were at stake, and they were being threatened. And these elites rightly feared the hegemonic plans of the Francophone state. So for example, in 1966, the multi-party system is dissolved by the president of the Francophone state then, and it becomes essentially a single party state. Thus, because of these larger political circumstances, in the smaller Anglophone or English-speaking regions, there starts to be several key questions that the political elites focus on. The first one was just who are we as a people? And second, just who are we as an Anglophone nation? In other words, what is our specific national identity? And it's at this point where my book makes historical interventions. And here is the outline of the specific parts of the book and the chapters. And as you can tell by the chapter titles, I had a lot of fun coming up with the themes for each chapter and each chapter title. So my book specifically focuses on how formerly educated citizens in urban regions of the English-speaking West Cameroon state, such as journalists, developed their own ideas about Anglophone national identity, and how women were very important to this political project. Women's everyday actions were essentially at the center, so they were at the heart of developing this strong Anglophone national identity in the 1960s and early 1970s. So one of my goals as a researcher and when writing the book was asking myself, how did women access these political spaces? So in an effort to answer these kind of questions, my book argues that formerly educated women access social and political power by invoking embodied nationalism, a concept that I define as a type of nationalism in which identities can be embodied through performance, emotional expression, and visual representation through, for instance, food, dress, and suitable conduct. And when I say suitable conduct, I mean how you walk, how you talk, whether or not you are shy, and so on. But within the Cameroonian context, I assert that female educated political elites invoked embodied nationalism to bring visual representations and emotional or effective practices of ideal Anglophone womanhood within urban settings. By emphasizing this embodied nationalism, they implied, heavily suggested, that women's everyday behaviors everyday patterns of behavior and comportment, the clothes that women wore, the foods they cooked, their refraining from gossip, and their adherence to appropriate marital behavior, such as not challenging their husband's male authority by chasing or beating their husband mistresses out in the open, might project a suitable Anglophone persona, especially in contrast to Francophone Cameroonian women like me, because I was born in the French-speaking region. So there were all sorts of stereotypes about the ways that French-speaking Cameroonian women behaved. You know, we were too aggressive, didn't wear African clothes, we were wearing French clothes, we don't know how to cook and clean. And so you can only imagine doing oral interviews was a really interesting process. And so I make these arguments over what I believe are 7 juicy chapters in the book. And the first half focused on women's political expressions. So there are women's organizations, there are formal anti-gossiping campaigns that were, you know, basically saying women at the market talk too much, that they're gossiping, that they're not working, they're not farming, they're not doing what women ought to be doing, that they're wasting time. And the second half really focuses on the political nature of everyday actions. So essentially how women's everyday political actions, such as clothing, became part of the Anglophone Cameroonian National Project. And I just wanted to go over some images that, that came from multiple sources, some from the archives, some from family members. And so these are the diverse sources that I was working with. And looking at the Cameroonian context by using the concept of embodied nationalism really allowed me to make key conclusions about how women experience social and political agency during the period of focus. They really wanted to construct these very conservative gender ideals to produce an Anglophone separatist nationalist movement, one in which they could shape ideas of a larger Anglophone national identity and culture. And this is very much present, very much visible in many of the sources that I looked at. And so it was very clear to me that there were these conversations about what does it mean to be a good mother, wife, and daughter for the home, society, and nation. And so you have these female political elites that are tying these really conservative ideas about womanhood to ideas about a larger Anglophone national identity. And so one of the projects that is taken up early on in this movement is trying to come up with ideas about what is our national cuisine, what are our national dishes. And so they start to have conversations about this in newspapers. So people write in and they say, we think our national cuisine should be this and that. And I just want to be clear that a lot of the envisionings about the Anglophone national identity at this time is being drawn from different sources. So local sources, continental sources, and sources beyond Africa. But I do think it's important to also emphasize that they're drawing a lot of these ideas from other African countries. So they're looking eastward, they're looking westward, they're looking to Kenya, and they're like, okay, Kenya has their national cuisine. Like, you know, shame on us, why don't we have one yet? And so all these domestic science centers that are around at this time start to emphasize this key goal of trying to figure out what are our national cuisines. And it ultimately culminates in this book called Auntie Kate's Cookery book, and because the author of this book actually was one of the ones, you know, focusing on this goal in domestic science centers, because she was a domestic science teacher herself. And I interviewed someone that was related to her, and they told me that when her book was first published in Cameroon, it was something that was circulated, it was free, but later on, as you can tell, it has the Macmillan publication date on the slide, and she told me that her aunt never saw any of the money or the profits that came from the book being published because they weren't asked. And so the book itself has an interesting history. And so here's some more of a taste from the newspaper about conversations about what are our native dishes. And so many of these national dishes that they are putting together essentially are inspired from dishes in Cameroon, but also dishes from Nigeria and other parts of the world. Oops. All right. And the second conclusion that I made was that leaders really wanted to assert the apolitical nature of their women's organizations and actions. And I want to be clear and say that there was a benefit to essentially trying to present this apolitical face, because the male-dominated political parties funded the women's initiatives and many of the goals that they wanted to take up. And so when they got funding, they then used that to essentially expand women's access to formal education, the professional workforce, political careers, and even to organize sports. And one of the ways in which they participated in continuing to shape ideas about an Anglophone national identity was helping to sponsor what were called British Week. And so British Week is a week in which the British culture was celebrated in English-speaking regions of Cameroon at that time. And so if you look at the date, it's 1968. The multi-party system in the Federal Republic has been dissolved in 1966. And so what you see is this really rapidly heightened anxiety among Anglophone political elites about maintaining a semblance of a national culture. And part of that is saying, oh, look, we have British heritage because we were formerly under British rule. And so let's dedicate a week to inviting British politicians here and essentially celebrating the British culture. But there was always a beauty competition, which women's organizations were also a part of because they would sponsor the participants and help groom them and so on. There was lots of conversations about who is the ideal woman to represent our nation. Does she subscribe to ideal gender norms? Oops. And here are a couple more sources in which there's ongoing conversations about the national costume. What's our national costume? Nigeria has one, Ghana has one. Shame on us that we don't have one. So there's literally a competition that is put together, and women draw and they submit their images and they say, this is what I think our national costume should be today. And so they have this essentially a fashion show in which they show the different finalists in their own dresses, and everyone votes on one. And today, if you speak to someone from the English-speaking region, they talk about, you know, what would you consider to be the national costume? It's this outfit, it's this costume that was chosen by female political elites and their women's organizations. And so their ideas about cultural values and identity are very much powerfully around, or they're very much powerfully present today. And just a few more sources showing ongoing conversations about women's organizations, how important it is. And the image to my far left of the screen is showing one of the women's wings of the male-dominated political party. And the women are essentially, they're going to start singing and dancing. And in my work, I emphasize that these moments of dancing and singing is one way in which women can verbally and emotionally express this unified idea about what the nation means to them and how they can shape ideas of cultural values. And so, you have these female political elites and the journalists and the teachers, and they're saying this is what ideal womanhood should be and so on. But you had women who repeatedly, regularly challenged gender norms to shape their own ideas of what a cosmopolitan ideal woman was. So from the housewife who would take her husband to court because he failed to provide food money, to the female boxer that you can see on this screen who won a match against her male opponent. And after the match, she informed a journalist, quote, "What a man can do, a woman can do." And she dared the women in the audience who were jeering at her that they can't challenge or her right as a boxer, and that, she was willing to have a boxing match with them next. But many urban elite women and men condemn the behaviors of such women who seemingly did not conform to their ideal womanhood in various ways. And they often compared this ideal womanhood to Francophone Cameroonian women. And this is something that really came out in the sources. And so you have female journalists that are saying, women are just out of control, housewives are chasing their husbands out in open and just beating them. This needs to stop. Housewives slapping their husbands first. It's just whole columns dedicated to housewives and to women that seem to be out of control. And this idea about women challenging gender norms being out of control, or this anxiety over it, filters out to ideas about suitable clothing practices. And what I started to see in the sources was in the late 1960s, there essentially starts to be this anti-slacks or anti-trouser campaign. And lots of conversations about women who have their own independent income, are formally educated, but now refusing to get married, spending money in their own way, going to the bar and buying their own drinks, are wearing slacks, right? And they're looking too westernized to some people. And there's accusations of them being sexually loose and not moral. But I do want to emphasize that this conversation is not a unified one, because you have female journalists that say, okay, yes, I agree that women should not be wearing slacks in church, bars, country clubs, but they can wear slacks when they go on a leisurely walk, right? Or, or they're playing tennis, right? But yes, there are some, times in which, you should not be wearing slacks, especially, for example, if you're going on a date. And men jump into this conversation too about women wearing slacks, and essentially when women wear slacks, they are essentially out of control. And in the archives, I found this gentleman, Charles, who wrote many articles about women's fashion, and at some point counted himself to be sort of this expert on women's fashion and what women ought to wear. So in 1970, he wrote this letter to the editor saying, women took over from men the wearing of trousers and shirts. Women tend to be interested in men's affairs more, but the men are simply not interested in their own. how will the men look like when they too wear blouses and skirts, frocks, and gowns? And he goes on to connect, women wearing, slacks or what women wearing men's attire to essentially the nation being under a threat, and that women now wear the pants, and that perhaps they're going to take over, the home, the domestic spaces, and political spaces. And so these women in slacks are increasingly identified as free girls or free women. Literally, I understood that as, being free from male authority, but it, wasn't seen in that way. It's seen as being, more insulting. And so you had people who would write into newspapers saying, I will tell you what a free woman is and how to essentially identify her. And so we have here a man who writes in saying, free women or free girls are working class girls and women who have by their attitude scared away men who might have married them. They dress in a deplorable manner. When they sit down, they smoke. The advanced ones smoke the marijuana. They drink only a few brands of beer, such as Gold Harp, Guinness, Beck's, and gin. And so he had a really clear idea of who a free woman was. And what starts to then happen is that their clothing practices is what starts to identify essentially who they are, whether or not they are free. And there starts to be this backlash against free women in slacks in bars, hotels, those who have their own jobs and their own apartments. And there starts to be this forced removal of essentially women in slacks from urban spaces to rural spaces. And so for those of you in African studies, there's been this ongoing conversation about how urban spaces were, seen as being not, as being morally corrupt for women, and the rural spaces, seen as being like the moral center, and so on. So these women in slacks were being essentially put on like buses and sent out of urban regions and sent to villages is how it was explained in the newspaper. So and the titles of the ongoing events in the newspapers were really dramatic, right? Mass sweep on free women begins, and they would be interviewing people, and they're like, yeah, she was wearing trousers, and and she was in the bar, and 5,000 free 5,000 free girls start journey back home, end of an era. And landlords start to kick women who essentially have their own income out of their apartments. They're banned from hotels and so on. And so when I was in the archives, I just found it really fascinating that when they would interview people, or even when I was even talking to people doing my own oral interviews, they often would say, back then women in slacks, in trousers and being in certain spaces did not, go well for you, in terms of how you would present yourself to the public. So the case of Anglophone Cameroonian embodied nationalism and its deep connections to gender and everyday nationalism, I would argue, is not isolated to Cameroon. And highlighting the strategies women use to navigate these, oftentimes turbulent political settings, my work provides insights into women's roles in separatist and secessionist projects across the world, such as in Quebec, Puerto Rico, and Tibet. And if we look to Tibet, for example, Tibet holds a Miss Tibet competition in India that has become a space to debate proper comportment and the embodiment of Tibetan nationalism and separatist ideologies. Oops. All right, that was meant to be a surprise. That's a little pop-up. But closer to home, when I lived in Texas for about 7 years, my students there were always saying, you know, Professor Mougoué, you are not a true Texan, and that Texas is essentially its own nation, right? And they would tell me that, you know, Texans have a particular attitude, a particular way of walking and talking. And my knowing response to many of my students was that, it seems like to me, Texans are invoking a form of embodied nationalism that is, I would agree, be reflected in their comportment. So if you look at these images, right, don't mess with, Texas, and that this comportment and their sartorial practices and ideas about gender and everyday nationalism is one in which we can see at home, right here. And we can see this in other states as well as in other countries of the world. And these examples suggest that embodied nationalism often emerges as a channel for tangible markers of national and cultural identity in political, social, or religious movements where individuals seek to claim and preserve authority and agency across time and space. And that's how I would normally end my talk, but today I thought that I would share a few more images from the archives that I was working at. It took me a while to find these images, but I'm sharing them because those of you who are Cameroonian might know that, it's not legal to take pictures of government buildings. And so I, put my life on the line to take these pictures. And I finally found them. And so I thought I would just share one of the key spaces that I was working at. So this is an image of the archives in the French-speaking capital, Yaoundé. This is the inside, even more illegal for me to have done this. It's blurry because I took the picture really fast. And then the second archive I was working at was in the English-speaking region. So Cameroon has 2 national archives, which I learned when I was doing dissertation research. And so this one is in Boya. This is the outside. And this is what it looks like if you're looking out the window. And so it faces an active volcano, but the volcano or the mountain is very, very pretty. So it's a nice site. All right. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mougoué, for a very interesting, fascinating talk. To everybody, if you have questions, please, you can type them. You can also raise your hands and you can talk. And for me, my question, while we wait for people to type their questions, is, first of all, just listening to your talk made me think about the impact really of colonialism in Africa, because this desire to be Anglophone, to be known as Anglophone, where we have this, they have the common heritage, their African heritage. Mm-hmm. So I wondered if you can explain a little bit, like what, in terms of ethnicity, like who lives where, is there a difference between the Anglophone area and the Francophone area, maybe?
In terms of culture, you mean?
Ethnic groups, what ethnic groups live?
Yes, there is great diversity. And so this is one of the reasons why the nationalist movement that I'm looking at is really focusing on saying, listen, let's not pay attention to our ethnic loyalty that just divides us. Let's focus on what unites us, right? What makes us all the same. And so one of the ways in which they say that, that they can be, that they are unified is that they were all under British French rule, right? And that they all have a unified understanding about laws, policies, what side of the road to drive on. And so there was a lot of discourse and rhetoric by the female political elites that, that ethnic loyalty would divide them. right? And that they needed to focus on the nation, on these larger ideas about what made them one people. Yeah.
But the same ethnic groups both in the, like, let's say.
Yeah, they can be. Yeah. There absolutely can be, where one is, was under French rule and the other was under British rule. Yeah. And then it's also the same with the border between Cameroon and Nigeria as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have here, thanks for brilliant presentation. Did you look at experiences of women other African countries with seemingly similar historical contexts?
Thank you, Suad. I did, because these other women were working with the women that were at the focus of my my work. And so the female political leaders that I look at are, they're drawing these ideas about politics, social movement from women in other African countries. And so they're flying there, traveling there, they're having conferences, meetings, exchanging ideas with each other. But I really wanted to focus on was what made the Cameroonian case different, what made it unique. But they certainly are connecting themselves to other women on the continent. So yes, I certainly had to sort of, do a little, background research and say, okay, what's going on in other parts, and what makes Cameroon different.
And Ike wants to know, what is gender nationalism?
Ike, okay. Can Ike clarify?
Okay, while we wait, let's to James Blackwell. What was the wearing of trousers viewed differently for women in Francophone Cameroon? Could you expand on the possible ways Anglophone women respond to attempts to
bust them?
Okay.
Hi, James. Thank you for being here today. That's an excellent question about, yes. So in the French rule region, or the formerly French rule region, yes, women in trousers were also being rounded up. And I found some really interesting stories. In Douala, for example, women were put in prison, and they were told, you need to get married to get out, or have like your boyfriend or someone come and get you. And so women would make all these arrangements with some man that they knew, and I thought that was a really interesting story. But so the same sort of anxiety about women in trousers is also unraveling over there. But I just thought it was really interesting how in the English-speaking region, it also becomes this larger conversation about what their national identity is, right? And so it's like, okay, women in trousers and at the bar, they're acting like French-speaking women, or like Western women, and so it gets enveloped in this larger conversation about what are our national culture and values. And I feel like James had asked the second part of, but his question went away. But oh, okay. Yes, so you were asking about women's attempts to, or women's resistance to being bussed away. Yeah, that certainly happens. And so many of the women would say, oh, I'm now married, I am no longer single, I've happily settled down, I'm at the market selling my fruit, or I'm doing what respectable women out to be doing. Or many of them would actually return back, because what ended up happening was that that these women are the economic heartbeat of the towns. And so you would have bankers and landlords, they would say like, you know, we have no money because these women were the ones banking with us. They were the ones, you know, renting from us, you know, and so it just ends up being where that women return, and this anxiety about, you know, women in trousers actually morphs into something else once the Republic becomes unified.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Kathleen asked, thank you very much for your talk. And then I would be interested in hearing more about your research methodologies, in particular one, how your positionality as a Francophone Cameroonian woman affected your oral interview. And second, how you look into the sources for subtle conservative forms of embodied nationalism, such as particular way of walking, speaking. I am assuming this aspect were more difficult to locate.
Caitlin, hello. I hope you're doing well today. Excellent questions. I'm going to start with question 2. So how am I looking into those sources for subtle conservative forms of embodied nationalism, such as walking and speaking, because these women are actually talking about it. And so in these women's columns, they literally have a column called "Being Too Shy is an Embarrassment for the Nation." And it's literally about women who have social anxiety when they're in social spaces. And they're like, you need to know how to hold conversation. You need to know how to smile, but not smile too much, or you look a little loose, right? You need to know how to walk better. I mean, they're literally having these conversations. And so, and a lot of these conversations came up also when I was doing oral interviews. So I would say, Caitlin, like it was literally in my face, right? All of these different conversations about women's comportment and everyday behavior. But as I was going through the process of revising the book, you know, in its early stages, I didn't really know what to do with all of those sources. They were there. And I was thinking, why are they having conversations about women being too shy, women using too much perfume, or women using too little perfume, women who smile too much, you know, instead of smiling the appropriate way. I didn't know what that really all meant. And so it wasn't really until I really sat down with the sources again and started thinking about it. And of course got book reviews, and the reviewers' comments were amazing. And you know, it was really when I really started to realize, okay, there's this larger theme that is coming up, right, about embodied nationalism and how it infiltrates intimate spaces. And then my research methods, my position, yeah, that's a really good question. So as someone with most of my family ties in Cameroon, doing research my research experience may not look like other people's research experience. There's benefits, but there's definitely also drawbacks. But one of the benefits was that I had access to family friends and to family members who helped me facilitate the oral interview process. And so when I was in the English-speaking regions, I stayed with really, really close family friends who I consider aunt and uncle, and their kids my cousins. And so they were from that area. And so my aunt was, you know, at the time in her late 50s. And so, you know, being in her late 50s, she had lots of networks and was part of, I don't know, 20 women's organizations. And so she was the one that would introduce me to the women that I was interested in interviewing. And she would say, here is my niece, this is what her research is, it's really important. And so, you know, without her, I mean, it would have been a much more difficult process. And so with her being there and also being a lot older than me, and I was interviewing with women in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and her being around their age, she wielded a lot of maternal authority, which, fortunately allowed me access to large group interviews. So I was interviewing women, 5 to 10 women at a time. And while I was interviewing them, they were often cooking, cleaning. I was cooking and cleaning with them too, as we were, talking. And they were always really interested in terms of like someone who was Francophone, like why I was interested in this history. And what was going on at that time shaped my interview process. The first time when I did my dissertation field research, there were presidential election going on. So people were like, why do you want to know this information? Are you a spy? And the second time it was, the elections were not going on and the process was much different. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you. In Kenya, okay, this is from Rachel. In Kenya, women dress has been used as an excuse for gender discrimination and violence. Are there instances of violence triggered by women's choice of dress?
So Rachel, I'm not sure if you mean in the contemporary era or in the 60s and 70s. So in the 60s and 70s, the time period that I am looking at, yes, but it's not violence in terms of what I've seen in the sources for Uganda, for example. There was just a lot of like pressure to leave certain spaces. And there were also rounding up of women. But when I was doing oral interviews and in the sources I was looking in the archives, I wasn't really seeing incidences of like, women getting beat to death, that it was just more sort of like, we're going to physically grab her and put her on this bus. Today, but I just also want to point out that it was a really odd experience being in the archives, reading about women and dress codes in the 60s, and then leaving the archives. And then at the time, the University of Boya was having this larger university conversation about what women wore to their classes. And there started to be this, I can't remember what was happening, but what from what I was hearing, if a student, if she showed up to campus in an outfit that was not seen as being suitable, she was sent home and told to go change her clothes and to come back. So it was this sort of this weird experience of being in the archives and then stepping out and then being like, oh, okay, these conversations are still happening.
Thank you. Frank has 2 questions. The first is about the representativeness of the sources from which you drew your conclusions. It seems you concluded mainly from consulting newspapers and from collecting experiences from women who inhabited urban areas. How representative would this have been of the entire national sentiment in the English-speaking regions?
Yes, thank you, Frank. Yeah, and so in the intro of the book, I'm very clear about who I am looking at. So I'm looking at the wives of political heavyweights, female journalists, teachers, and so they represent the minority, but they're the largest voices or the loudest voices in trying to develop and shape ideas about national identity and cultural values. And I don't go too much in this talk, but they also try to infiltrate these ideas to rural spaces. And so when they set up schools for girls, they're the ones who open up schools for girls. They're the ones who open up nurseries, domestic science centers, and the prominent female political elites at this time would go on what we would call these home visiting tours where they go to rural spaces and visit different towns and villages and speak to the women. And much of these conversations are happening in the urban settings. They're also having these conversations when they're going on their tours or visits of the rural spaces. And yes, given the rate of urbanization, yes, it was indeed low in the late 60s and in the late 1970s. And so, so the main focus in the work are these women that are increasingly the ones that are making the population of the urban spaces explode. They are going from the rural spaces to the urban spaces to enter the professional workforce, to go to different types of domestic science classes, to open up their own clothing shop, restaurants, and so on, which is why when there's attempts to remove them or to remove many of them based on their clothing, the economic, stability of the towns can't survive. But I'm very clear in the work who are the main focus. They're not women mostly in the rural spaces. It's the urban female political elites who are framing their ideas about national culture. And you were talking about the sources. I think, wait, I might have, yeah, so I'm consulting newspapers, oral interviews. So those were my two main sources. So the archives and the oral interviews that I did, where I was interviewing the women themselves who lived through the time period. And what was fascinating, Frank, was, sometimes I would discover things in the archives based on what the women were telling me. And so I found out about the anti-gossiping campaign based on oral interviews. And I went to the archives and I had somehow missed it. And it just popped out at me. And so it was really fascinating, the ways in which I found sources. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you. And Ryan wants to know how your identity as a Francophone Cameroonian shaped your research, if at all.
Yeah, so I talked a bit about how it definitely shaped how I conducted oral interviews on the ground, and that I worked with an aunt who was from that area, and she was the one that helped facilitate my contacts with many of these women, the women's organizations, and so on. And I would say that another way in which it shaped my research was I was not very clear about the history of the British rule parts of Cameroon at all. When I first started doing my dissertation research, I was going to do research on Francophone Cameroonian women. I was not looking at women from the English-speaking regions at all. It just happened to be that, the aunt that I had just mentioned earlier, she lives in Boya, and they said, have you been to Boya? And I said, no. They're like, come down, for a week or so when you take a break from the archives. And I was like, okay. So I took a bus there, and my aunt said, oh, you've been in the archives. Have you been to the other archives, to the other national archives? And I was like, and I said, there's a second national archives. So she dragged me up the mountain and she said, here's the national archives for the English speaking regions. And so, and she knew the archivist. And so we were able to easily enter. And it was, I mean, it was just, for me, it was an amazing experience because I was completely new to the history. And so the main archivist would sit me down and say, Anglophone Cameroonian history 101, and like tell me and talk for like 3-4 hours, in the archives, we would go out to eat, and then as we were out eating, he'd drag someone into the conversation and say, okay, it's time for you to tell her this part of this story. And so for me, it was all new. And so I think that because it was all new to me, there were certain patterns I could see, but I'm also seeing it from a particular perspective in terms of ideas about national identity. But it definitely shaped how people saw me, for sure. And people were really confused sometimes. They'd say, well, but you speak English, so and you live in the US, so does that also make you an Anglophone Cameroonian? So there were these conversations about what does it mean, right? So it was interesting. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you very much. And I don't know, you give it a try. At which moment everyday life actions become political?
Oh, was that Baskuda who asked that question? Oh, hi, Baskuda. Okay, yes, at which moment everyday life actions become political? It's when you wake up in the morning and you decide what clothes are you going to wear. And so I always tell my students, everyday actions are very much politicized. And it's really fascinating because the current students that I have seem to really thoroughly understand that the politics of hair is one in which it's an intimate act that is very politicized. So I often start off with talking about hair because it seems to be one in which we can easily grasp how everyday life actions become political, how you wear your hair, how you shape it, especially for Black women and men, and it can be something that is very much politicized. In fact, it is politicized. And so whether or not you wear trousers or slacks and what comportment and demeanor you present are not mundane things. They're very important. And like I argue in my book, they can be wrapped up in political projects. Yeah, and so, yeah, thank you.
And Frank, I think, is coming back to this idea of, so he said, my second question is about your separation of what you term Anglophone and Francophone cultures. And I guess this is kind of also my question, like, let me continue his question. Would this not have been more of a reflection of the degree of assimilation of the respecting French and British cultures? And I think that's maybe why it's important that you really describe the people that you're talking about. They were the elite.
Yeah.
About the elite. It's not the everyday people.
Yeah.
So, especially given that social attributes such as dressing and suitable conduct would have been copied directly from the Europeans. So here it's really the elite in the Anglophone that were leading this national.
Yeah, I think, Frank, these are really great questions, but I just want to clarify that they're not copying and pasting. They have agency and they have their own understanding of how they interpret what suitable conduct is and what are suitable social attributes. It's not copy paste. And so what you have is that they're borrowing these ideas from very different places. And so they're borrowing it from, local spaces, from Francophone Cameroonian spaces. They definitely are borrowing there, spaces from Nigeria. And so there's lots of influences that are shaping ideas about what is the Anglophone national culture. It's not, it's not one in which many of the people that I am looking at went to these British Christian mission schools, right? And so that background definitely shapes their ideas about what suitable conduct is or what suitable dress is. However, they're not copying pasting. They're also drawing from other ideas about what suitable conduct and dressing means. And a lot of times when they're shaping these ideas about, what is our culture, is very much tied to what women are doing. And so if we look at, women putting together the national costume, the national costume actually comes from a certain area of English-speaking Cameroon that used to be worn by men only, especially royal men. And so the women co-opt this and they say, we think this could be our national costume, and so it becomes one in which it's worn by women too, but the men don't have an issue with that. They're very happy. They applaud. They're like, yes, 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 continue on, because this has something to do with the African culture. But then when the women, are wearing trousers, but the men are also wearing trousers or also Western style trousers. What women are wearing then comes under attack, but it's not really the trouser itself. It's that they're pushing gender boundaries and gender norms, and they're reshaping their very own idea about cultural values. So I just want to just be very clear. It's not, we were under French or under British rule and we're going to copy paste what our experience was at that time. What tradition meant in the 1960s oftentimes was something that had just appeared, at that time period. It wasn't always, tradition wasn't always ideas that were borrowed from the far, far removed past. So they're also creating ideas about what tradition means to them.
Thank you. Renee has a question about Muslim women. Trousers are worn by women in certain Muslim countries. So Idi Amin had trousers, but the ban was lifted. So I don't know, how does this fit into your discussion?
Yeah, so the one thing I failed to point out when I was going through the maps of Cameroon was that the half of the British ruled area joins Francophone Cameroon. The other half is predominantly Muslim and joins Nigeria. So the southern part that I'm looking at, or southern part that's part of the country today, is predominantly Christian. Protestant Christian, although one of the key leaders of the women nationalist movement was a fervent Catholic, but most of the women are Christian. However, there are Muslim women that are part of the movement for sure. And I also interviewed them, and it was really fascinating to see how these women access political power in different ways, but there was still a discourse about women being the good mother, the good wife, and the good daughter. So yes.
Great. And I think Philip has a question that you already answered, but isn't it something of a controversy to talk about West Central women defining their identity against the backdrop of labels like Anglophone and Francophone, and within a geographical and political structure designed by Europeans?
Yeah, excellent question, Philip. Okay, and so they're using the elements of their colonial legacy to reinforce their political power, and they're using these these geographic boundaries as a way to say, look, this is who we are, this is where we are as a people. And so these are conversations that really matter at the time. And these are conversations that are framing their ideas of political identity. And I wouldn't say it's a controversy to talk about West Central women defining their identity against a backdrop of labels like Anglophone and Francophone, because this is what they're telling me. It's not controversial. And this is the way in which, when we think about in Cameroon, when we think about certain cuisines from certain parts of the country, or even clothing and so on, a lot of these understandings of these diverse cultural identities, particularly the English-speaking region areas, are ones in which was national discourse in the 1960s and in the early 1970s. And I'm very clear about it when I say, these women's efforts is more powerful than what the men were doing at that time, because it actually resonates to this day in a very powerful way. It was long lasting. And it was also really fascinating to see that, the different ways in which women's political organizations survived attacks on the multi-party system, using their international and transnational ties. And I mean, just really, really fascinating. But yes, this is how they're defining themselves against this backdrop. I will say though, Philip, though the terminology Anglophone and Francophone, to stay consistent in the book, I say I'm going to use these terms because at that time in the 60s and early 1970s, there was more of a clearer understanding of what that meant. Whereas today, you know, I've met people from English-speaking Cameroon that say I'm Southern Cameroonian, not Anglo. There's different conversations happening today, but for the time period I'm looking at, the understandings of the distinctions between the two, even though sometimes I would say that there really isn't any, but it's really about understanding the different ideas of what the nation is. Thank you, Philip.
So what has a question? How much resistance did the free women meet from patriarchal structures in Cameroon? What strategies did they use to counter patriarchy?
For the free women? Okay, yeah, that's a, I'm trying to see where the question is. Oh, how much resistance? Yeah, I mean, resistance happens in many ways, right? It happens in choosing your own husband, delaying when you're going to get married, not asking family for, you know, blessings before, deciding when, where you're going to travel, which spaces you are going to move in, which bars you're going to go in, whether or not you smoke cigarettes, you know. And so resistance was happening in everyday intimate spaces. But I wouldn't say it's resistance. It's just, you know, challenging gender norms, and redrawing new ideas about cultural values and identity. But this is happening in male-dominated spaces. And so there's lots of anxiety about, you know, these formally educated women who seem to have lost respect for their cultural, for their cultural values and identity. So there was a lot of anxiety about women who were sent to study abroad coming back to westernized, or coming back from Nigeria having lost their culture. And so, but yet it was really interesting that those same conversations about men who were sent abroad, they would actually literally say, you know, men come back from being in Europe for 9 years, for example, and they come back the same way, respecting our culture. But women, they go abroad for like 2 weeks and they come back and they've completely changed. And you know, they're like, you know, you know, is it because of their education? Is it because they don't want to be, you know, good women anymore? And so there's definitely lots of conflicting, blurred, overlapping ideas about ideal gender norms.
Thank you. You have many questions.
Okay.
We're almost there. Paulette wants to know how your project has been received in Cameroon.
Project. Okay, that's a great question, Paulette. So I got direct feedback from people who read my manuscript. And so I had Cameroonian historians read it and give me their feedback. And so I've had a few people who have told me that they read it in Cameroon and they liked it. It's just been, you know, I think I'm not really sure, Paulette. I mean, I can really just talk about when I present the research and how it's been presented, how it's been received by Cameroonians in different spaces, in very different ways. I know that if it's mostly men there, it's sometimes the reception is not the best because first, you know, I'm a female historian, I'm talking about serious politics, challenging the national narrative, and why am I not here with my husband and on kids? And so it gets received a very different way. But, you know, if I'm around people who do gender studies, the reception is different. So thank you, Paulette.
George's question is a little long. I'm going to let you read it, and I will give you a time also to rest a little bit.
Okay, so George, you're asking, was it not because of the lack of the existence of political independence or autonomy for the Anglophone state of West Cameroon that inspired Anglophone Cameroons and Anglophone women to develop notions and political philosophies about Anglophone nationalism and Anglophone national identity? But to them, there was autonomy. There is definitely an understanding of what autonomy looked like within different spaces. And so there was cultural autonomy, social autonomy. If we look at culture, all of a sudden being told, you know, you need to speak French to, you know, have it to a government job or a government interview, when it's supposed to be a dual language, you know, country where everyone, you know, supposedly, you know, on paper can be able to speak both French and English. It becomes very problematic, and this is why there's all this anxiety about, you know, when we talk about national identity and values, it also is connected to autonomy. You know, so the agency to decide, you know, who are we as a people? I mean, nevertheless, it's select people who are having that conversation, but, you know, still having that conversation about who are we as a people. So there is that understanding at the time that there is autonomy. And so, I mean, so the vice president's wife, I mean, she was like first lady, you know, represented the English speaking regions in different spaces in, you know, US and Canada, you know. And so there was this understanding that, yes, we have a distinct national identity with our own policies and also with our own, you know, trading policies.
Thank you. And Greg wants to know if there has been changes, like he say, I'm thinking major work considering you can take pictures without fear of being jailed.
Have there been major changes?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the picture taking thing, I mean, it just, yeah, it's just what the rules are. I mean, I don't know how many people break the rules, but I know I do. But in terms of changes, right now in Cameroon, you know, if we look at the political landscape, things are not the best. There was lots of, you know, resistance to, there were, I think it was in 2016 or 17, there started to be this major push for, you know, high school, major push for teachers and lawyers in English speaking regions to only converse in French. And so there started to be lots of anxiety, like there was in the 60s and early 1970s, that their autonomy, cultural autonomy is being attacked in key spaces like the courtroom or in schools. And so unfortunately, that meant that what we started to see was this larger movement against the Francophone dominated states rising up in 2018, 2019 in the English speaking regions. I won't go at length about it, but there's lots of conversations about, you know, what's going on at the military level and in the civilian level, but it hasn't been good. And but I will stop there because I could go on for hours about that subject. But things in Cameroon, particularly in the English-speaking regions, are not the best right now.
Okay. And the last question is from Anne. She wants to know, how did the African-American culture inform the 60s cultures in Cameroon?
Anne, thank you so much for that question, and really great question to end this presentation on. Oh, if I could have had a chapter on that, that would have been amazing. And so when these female political elites are drawing ideas about cultural identity, they're also drawing it from African Americans in the US. And so they know names, and they say, this woman is the first Black female politician and this and that. So us women over here need to, you know, step up our own game. And so they are very much aware. They are reading Ebony magazine to look for ideas about comportment and suitable conduct. It's not just copy British and not just copy and paste from British and the French. They're also looking to Black Americans about what is suitable conduct, how should we walk, how, what is, hairstyles. And so, yes, they are definitely looking to the Black American culture in terms of dress and hairstyle as well, which also gets into some sticky conversations, because when you have many Black Americans who start to have an afro, you have lots of Cameroonian women or African women who are using the hot comb to straighten out their hair. And there is this conversation in one of the newspaper columns, by an African-American man who was like, okay, you should wear your hair natural and it shouldn't be poofy. And it shouldn't be straightened. The Cameroonian person says, oh, no. It's the process that matters. The hair can be straightened, but when you put water, it goes back to being Afro. But if you do the permanent stuff, then that's a whole nother conversation. And so it's just a really interesting piece of primary source that I found. But I do want to point out, surprise, surprise, who's at the heart of all these conversations? Women. Black American women, African women, about what's the ideal, look for Black women and men in Africa and in the US as well. So thank you, Anne, for that great question.
Thank you very much to you, Dr. Mougoué, for an excellent talk. We all enjoyed it. And thank you, everybody, for coming. And I'll see you next Thursday.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.